Hey woodworkers. So next step in preparing for making material for our bent lamination is going to be actually to cut the strips. And so what I've done here, I've already milled this board. I started with 8/4. I want it as thick as I possibly can, and going from there. Check the blade for square. What I'm going to be doing is looking at, oh, there you are, looking at grain direction. Here you can see that this is a flat sawn board, so I have these things going this way, which means that if I cut these into strips, in essence each one of these strips is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of a 1/4 sawn or a rift sawn piece. And it's okay, depending on the thickness of the strips that you're creating, this could be a factor. Most of the material, given the dimensions we're going to be making for this application, will be totally fine to bend. But if I were to make these things thicker, so 1/4 inch plus, then I really need to start being critical about grain orientation with how I make those layers. So I'm going to shoot for 1/8 of an inch here. 1/8 of an inch of material has very little memory with respect to the grain orientation and the structure. If I wanted to go thicker, then I would need to orient this board in a different way and basically do some resawing so that I have a flat sawn board. And in doing so, you get a better bend basically when we're doing this, a little bit less of that spring back structure. So, okay. So there's two ways I can do this. I need to cut this into a bunch of strips. I think the obvious choice would be to create a gap here on the blade of whatever your dimension needs to be. So if I'm looking for 1/8 of an inch, I basically have it. Okay, so that's about 1/8 of an inch there. And I can do a bunch of strips this way, and that's fine. I have found that this is not as effective in cutting these boards accurately. And what happens is, when cutting this material here, so let's say there's a piece here between the blade and the fence, when I'm cutting, depending on the length of this thing, shorter boards do better in this application than longer ones, but I'd still shy away from this if possible. What happens is, the further I get into the cut, there's less rigid material on the back of the blade. So back here, there's still material to keep this distance consistent. Behind where the blade is at, then what happens, I find, is that this board starts to pinch just a little bit, and it starts to cut the backside of the blade on the edge, on the outfeed side, which is never a good situation. But it also pulls the piece that's still connected, pulls it away from the blade, and it starts to create this really nasty taper. So we have a safety factor. We also have a quality of cut factor to consider. So I would not go with this option. Instead, what I would do is I would move the fence further away, and I would try to establish my cut in this orientation here. And if any of you have ever tried to repeat this cut, so I'll make one piece, that's fine. I'll get that to whatever thickness I need, and that's great. The challenge becomes if I need two pieces that are the same thickness. And so I'll need to allow or set up for that. First of all, let me measure this thing. And I like 1/8 of an inch for this application just because it's easy to do the math on based on our final dimension. I kind of like where that's at, actually. I think. No, I don't. Thought I did, but I do not. Alright, open this over. I still think I'm a little late. I'm trying to measure on the outside of the tooth that's facing my left. So I kind of like where that's at. So in doing this, we do a little test cut. Let me do that. So there's a couple ways I can measure that cut, and I need to be as accurate as possible. So this kind of tool I think we all gravitate towards, and it looks like I'm right on 1/8 of an inch, which is great. But slightly more accurate is my square. I can line the blade of the square up, and it looks like I'm pretty close to where I want to be. It actually looks a little bit heavy of 1/8 of an inch if I trust that my eyes are accurate enough to really see where the 1/8 of an inch line is here, and it consistently follows where it needs to go. When dealing with greater accuracy, I prefer a dial gauge like this, or dial calipers I should say. So in doing this, I can get these little guys in there, and I can measure off. I am at 1 and basically 15th. So I have a little ways to go, but not by much. I'm a little bit under 1/8 of an inch. So if I want this to be a little bit larger, bumping the fence over to the left, and then I'll retest this. It looks pretty substantial. All right. One more test. I'm over now. Yeah, I'm way over. So I'm at 260 or so. I want to be at 225. Ooh, right on the money. Okay. So 125, that's 1/8 of an inch, so I'm ready to go. So this first piece is just my test. I'm going to rip this off and forget about it. Oops, I hate that noise. A couple things I want to do. I want to make sure that I'm setting up so that I can always get these boards back into sequence, because part of the beauty of doing a bend with these strips is that I want to be able to see the grain, and as much as I can control orientation that these things go in, I want to. So I'm going to make a mark like this so that when I make these cuts, I'll be able to identify which strip goes in which order, and then I won't be able to flip it. All right, so all of that's fine and well. How do I repeat this process? So I need to be able to set up a fence, because my math is not that good, nor is my fence accurate enough to bump over another what will be a 1/4 of an inch. So the thickness of the blade being 1/8 of an inch, thickness of the material that I want to keep being another 1/8 of an inch, that should be a 1/4 of it. It's just, I'm never going to be that good. So there is this little gizmo. This is referred to as a thin Rip Jig. It's got this little slot that goes into your miter gauge slot. I'm sorry, this thing goes in the miter gauge slot. There's also a little bearing on the end. So locking this in, pushing it over to my right, nice and tight to the position that this thing is at currently. This will hold this board into that spot as I rip, but then more importantly, after I'm done with that first cut, I'll be able to put this piece into place, bump the fence over until that bearing engages and gives me a little bit of a pressure there, and it holds for the cut. So once I've done that, then I can repeat this thing as many times as I need to. Last piece about this that I'll talk about is that a lot of people that do this, they ask a couple of questions. They ask why use the table saw blade, because there's basically a 50% waste here. If I'm trying to save 1/8 of an inch here, but I lose 1/8 of an inch, why couldn't I use the bandsaw? Good question. The bandsaw is good at cutting a thinner kerf, but it makes a really rough surface. And so it's not appropriate for a glue surface if I were to do the same process over on the bandsaw. It's going to be too rough, and I have to machine those mill marks off from the bandsaw blade, and then I'm right back to wasting that material, possibly more than on the table saw. The other question that sometimes arises is, why not just use a thin kerf blade? And I think that's a good option. If you have a thin kerf blade, do it. I do not have one, and I just can't justify the additional cost of saving a 32nd of an inch or a 1/60th of an inch for a thinner kerf. So this just seems to work. I totally understand the argument, but for what this thing is, this is an easy choice. All right, let me cut this one. I'll bump it over, show you the next one, and then I'll tap out and go to the next video. All right, just as a reminder, these are my first test pieces, but I want to make sure that these are the same thickness, and so I'm pretty happy with this. I also get a fair amount of flex and twist, should I need to, for this material. So that's what I'm going to be doing for the next series. I'll record that under a time lapse, so hopefully if you have nothing else to do, that will be enjoyable for 2 minutes. Anyway, I'm going to cut these things. I will cut as many of these strips as I need to make up my overall thickness, plus maybe 2 extra just to be safe. I think that's everything. Okay, see you in a sec.